This is Talking Rackheads. Hi, I'm Nigel from The Art of Sound, and this is episode 6 of Talking Rackheads. Well, VCV Rack 0.6 is now out in everybody's hands, and to be honest with you, it was a pretty pain-free upgrade for me at least. There were a couple of niggly little problems on day one, but after those were resolved, then it's been pretty pain-free, and I've got to say, 0.6 is remarkably stable, especially for what is a piece of beta software. I've really been enjoying the new features, and all the new and updated plugins that have come out are really, really good. Now, I was going to do a 0.6 special edition of Talking Rackheads, where I'd go through all the new features. But to be honest with you, so many people have already made so many videos about the new features that I felt I'd just be repeating what everybody else had already covered. So instead of that, well, you see, there are some new plugins that are about to be released, and a couple of them are really special. So I thought I'd take a look at some of those instead. The first one is from Vult. This is the new Noxious from Vult. This is something quite interesting. So when Leonardo first told me about Noxious, and he actually posted a little video on the Facebook page with Noxious off screen so you couldn't actually see it, the sounds it made immediately attracted my attention, because as some of you will know from previous episodes of Talking Rackheads, I love the way that Leonardo models his oscillators and filters, and this one had a character all of its own again, something I heard and thought, wow, I could really enjoy this, because it is not your standard pure sounding oscillator. It's dirty. It's nasty. It's got some real grit to it, and I think it's pretty amazing, to be honest. But let me show you what I mean, and then you can decide for yourself. So what I've got here is I've got the Noxious plugin. I've got a scope so you can see the waveform. I've got a volume control over here, and I've got some LFOs which I'll be using later to modulate some of the parameters. But let's just start off with the basic waveform. Let me just turn up the volume. So there we go. That's just a basic sort of square formy type of waveform. And the waveform is selected here in the wave knob, and you can rotate it and turn it into a more sawtoothy type sound. So you've got a basic waveform that morphs between a square sort of waveform and a sawtoothish waveform. And that's the basic waveforms that you work with. Now the next thing you've got is a harmonic control, and this adds or takes away harmonics from the waveform itself. And I'm going to reduce the harmonic content of this waveform so you can hear what it sounds like. You can hear that sort of stepping through the harmonics as they come into play. And if I go the opposite way and go for the square type waveform, then you can hear how the harmonics work. So those are the two basic sort of controls for the simple waveform manipulation of this module. There's also on this side a tune control with fine, coarse and in semitones, and then you've got a switch here that changes this from typical oscillator range to low frequency oscillator range, which basically, as it says, turns it into a LFO. I'm going to focus mainly on the oscillator today, but I will say that the LFO's got some really interesting possibilities for this as well, but that will come in a later video. Now we go over to this section, and this is the FM section of the oscillator. So this is adding frequency modulation to the waveform, and I'm going to turn it up so you can hear. And I'll turn up the main FM control. And there are two forms of waveform for the FM, a sawtooth and a sine wave. And then there's the frequency that's used with it, which if I increase, in here it's stepping through in sort of harmonics, in octaves basically, of the frequency. That's because I'm in ratio mode here. If I switch it to free mode, now it's a smooth frequency modulation. And back to ratio again, it's back to the stepped version. And I really like that capability because it does make a big difference with the type of FM that you want. There's also an external FM, so you can feed your own waveforms into this and use those to modulate the oscillator, and you would plug your input here in the FM input port right there, and then this you would turn up and down to add that. Of course, the two can be used in combination, which gives some incredible frequency modulation effects depending on what you're feeding in here and how you modulate this. And I'm going to come to how you modulate all this in a second, but I just want to show you the basic functionality first. So now come out of that, back to the standard waveform, and now the next thing I want to look at is the phase controls here. So what the phase controls do by themselves can be quite subtle. They're very sort of gentle changes in lots of ways. Some are not quite so gentle, but overall these by themselves give a subtle change to the tone of the output. So here's the overtone. And then the body. The boost, which is sort of like a bottom end fattener. It sort of thickens things up nicely. and then a sort of feedback loop. So these 4 controls again add a lot of possibilities of tone shaping the output from the oscillator. And again, I'm going to come to how you use these in a moment. Then we've got a sawtooth, we've got a sub-harmonic generator, a sub-oscillator. And again, it's quite subtle, but it's definitely there. And again, it comes into play when you start modulating other things. And then you've got a noise generator, which adds a little bit of noise to the entire effect. And these two come into their effect, especially the noise, when you're filtering and when you're using the gate down here to trigger, which I'll explain in a moment. And then you've got a glide control that will glide between notes, except when it receives a gate in this mode, or on every pitch, every gate, when it's in the always mode. Okay, so that's the basic waveform shaping side. But then we have a section called chaos, and this relies on getting a gate input here. So I've got a little pulsed gate coming in, and I'm going to turn up the spread and turn up the settle factor. And it gives this sort of random bit of chaos to the waveform. Now you're starting to see the possibilities coming in, this gateform of tonal changes in time with rhythm. And you can get some really, really interesting pulse effects. I've been using Noxious for drones recently, and I absolutely love it for this because you can really do some interesting stuff over time. Now I'm going to alter the overtones and again combine with the chaos. And a bit of FM. And a bit of sub. Now we're getting some really rich, dirty sounds. But where this module really comes into play is when you start using modulation. And the modulation section here is exactly the same as found in the VCV. And that is, to modulate a parameter, you click on one of these 6 buttons, like the A button, and then you move the control that you want to assign to it. So in this case, overtone. So now overtone is going to be controlled by this low frequency oscillator here coming into this port here, and this is the attenuator for it. So as I increase the attenuation, the overtone parameter will change over time. Now I've done the same with the body command and the feedback command, and I'm going to turn those on as well. And now I'm going to add feedback into it. And then I'm going to add the frequency to it as well. And now you're getting some really, really interesting modulation. I'm now going to speed up the gate so you can hear what happens when the gate tempo is increased, so you get this more rhythmic pulsing effect. Wonderful. I love all those tonal changes happening in time. And that's the Noxious in essence. It can generate some really wonderful howly, screamy sounds, some really thick, complex, distorted oscillator effects. And that's what this is for. It's such a great module for that. And for that reason, you know, this has suddenly jumped to the top of my league of oscillators for those type of sounds. Those dirty, gritty, cut through the mix sounds, this can do with ease. And literally the modulation possibilities of this are incredible because of Leonardo's method of modulation means that you can play around with this to your heart's content and get all sorts of different effects and modulation sources in such a simple way, just by assigning these things to each of your modulation sources, be them LFOs or sequencer pitch or whatever you want, and then just assigning the amount and level from here, and you've instantly got 6 modulation sources that are yours to do as you wish. Oh boy, wow. Okay, so that's the Noxious. It's a quick first look at it, quick demo of what it can do. And that's it. Well, no, not quite. Because there's one last little thing about the Noxious. Let me show you. This is the polyphonic version of Noxious. Yep, polyphonic. 3 outputs on the right hand side for each voice. And each one of these voices can be triggered individually, can have its own pitch information, its own tuning, and its own level control. And this, added to the main Noxious itself, is some one hell of a fat oscillator. Let me show you what I mean. And hold on to your hats here because it's pretty big. So there is the basic Noxious. I've set up a quick patch, done some modulation, set up some things, and now I'm going to turn on the polyphonic section, which I've done some detuning with, added some extra gates to give some rhythmic quality to, bit of panning, and then I'm just going to jam with it and let you hear just how big and fat this can be. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's like, oh boy, hell yes. This thing becomes this big, fat, beefy, soul-destroying, cut-through, obliterate everything oscillator. And I absolutely love it. I mean, damn, this thing is so good. And you can have so much fun with it. So, there you go. Quick look at Noxious, the single and the polyphonic version. I'm sure it's going to be available soon for everybody, and I know that Vult will post in Facebook when it is. But I've got to say, this for me is just so much fun to play with. I mean, oh, I can't express how good I think it is. It is just one heck of a module, I've got to say. Okay. Thanks, Leonardo. Brilliant work, mate. I mean, dang. Okay, and now on to the next video. At this point, I intended to have another episode of Build Your Own Synth, but unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond my control, aka my MIDI-Man 8x8 MIDI interface, after 13 years of flawless operation, stopped working. Yeah, got to get a new one. So I can't do that this week as I planned. So instead, here's the first in a new series called Rack to Basics. Hi, and welcome to a new segment called Rack to Basics. Now, Rack to Basics is going to be a sort of introductory series of videos that show you how you use the basic parts of a modular system to create music. I'm not going to be doing things like specific modules or anything like that. It's more about techniques, things that everybody uses, but a lot of people don't know how to use them or even why. So that's what I'm going to try to explain a little of in each of these videos. So in this particular video, we're going to look at something called modulation. Now, what's modulation? Well, in simple terms, when you modulate something, you vary the value of something over a period of time. For example, the volume of something over a number of beats or over a number of seconds. And that basically is what modulation is. But you can use modulation to modulate all kinds of different things, not just volume, but pitch, filters, speed, envelopes, you name it, it can be modulated. And modulation gives motion or movement instead of something being very static. So instead of something staying the same all the time, if you vary it a little bit with modulation, it creates interest and movement in your sound. So I'm going to give you a demonstration of modulation. First of all, here is a single pitch being repeated with no modulation whatsoever. So you could hear there, it was the same sound every time the note repeated. Now what I'm going to do is create some modulation. And in this instance, I'm going to use an LFO. An LFO is something that creates a voltage that rises up and falls, for example. And this is a typically very useful form of modulation. So I'm going to take an output from, in this case, the triangle output of an LFO, and I'm going to input it into, in this case, the tiny Saurish's modulation input. Now, it happens to be called modulate in this. It doesn't have to be. There are lots of different types of inputs that can be modulated. But in this case, with the tiny Saurish, if you feed a value into the mod input, it changes the waveform over time. In other words, the rise and fall of the LFO will change the type of waveform the tiny saw is outputting. If I play now, you should hear this happening. And there you go. You could hear that waveform changing over time. And it was changing according to the speed or frequency of which this LFO was working at. So if I reduce the frequency, the change would take longer. In other words, the differences in the waveform would happen slower over a period of time. If I speed up the LFO, then they would happen quicker over a period of time. Let me let you hear that, and then you'll see what I mean. So here's sort of fairly slow changes. Now I'm going to speed up the LFO. Now I'll slow it down again. And there you go. So that's a basic form of modulation, changing the tonal sound of, in this case, an oscillator over time using an LFO for the modulation itself. Very straightforward, very simple. But now I'm going to use the same method. In other words, I'm going to use the LFO, but instead of changing the modulation of the waveform, I'm going to open and close the filter. So I take the output from the triangle wave LFO, and I'm going to feed it into what we call a CV modulation input. That's this thing here. And so again, what's going to happen is the LFO is going to create a rising and falling voltage, which will then change, open and close the filter. So it will go from dull to bright and then back down to dull over a period of time. So here we go. Nothing's happening. I've got the LFO output going into the input for the cutoff of the filter, but the filter isn't opening and closing. It's staying exactly the same. Okay, so that's because this CV input, control voltage input, has an attenuator above it. So what's an attenuator? Well, in simple terms, an attenuator determines the range of effect that whatever you're feeding into it has on the item you're trying to modulate. So when it's pointing directly up, in other words, it's at 0, it means maximum attenuation. Nothing coming in from this LFO will affect this cutoff. It basically does nothing. The more I turn this to the right, this little tiny knob here, then the more effect the LFO will have on opening and closing the cutoff. So let me just turn this a little bit and you'll hear it working. And I'm just going to turn down the opening and closing so it'll start at about halfway. Now if I run the clock and start the pulse going so you can hear that repeating note, you should now hear a change in the filter opening and closing in time with the rise and fall from the LFO. And the more I turn the attenuation to the right, the more you're going to hear that variation in the filter opening and closing. go. And then you could actually hear the filter getting brighter and then getting darker slowly over time, depending on what the speed of the LFO that's running over here is doing. Now, again, just to point out some basics of this, in this case, the attenuation works from the 0 point here, and the more you turn it to the right, the wider the range is. But this is an attenuator when you go to the right, so that means that the only part that's affected is the top end of the attenuation. In other words, if this was set to a value of 0, and if when you turn the knob fully round to the right, this was 100, then this would reduce the top value from 100 downwards the more I turned it towards the center point. So for example here, this would allow the filter to go from 0 to say 20. If I turn it all the way round to the right, it would go from 0 to 100 fully open. If I put it halfway, then it would go from 0 to 50, say. And in this case, if I want to start it at a lower point, in other words, the filter needs to be closed more to begin with, then I have to close the filter. So say, for example, I set the filter here and turn this up to full. Now the filter will open all the way around, but will start at this point. So you'll hear something like this. And whilst I'm doing this, I'm going to change the filter point, cutoff itself, where it starts from, so you'll hear the differences. I'm also going to speed up the LFO so you can hear it happening quicker. So you now hear there's a much wider range of the filter opening and closing. If I move this cutoff to set the lowest point to be higher, in other words, the filter will be more open at the lowest possible point, it will sound like this. She didn't quite go so quiet, so dark at the lowest point. And if I rotate it further to the right, then you could hear that working too. So that's attenuation from here. Now, attenuation is normally from the top end down, but you can also have something called an attenuverter, which basically allows you not only to reduce the amount from the top end down, but also reduce the amount from the bottom end up. And with something like this control, you achieve that by turning it to the left. So now it's the top that stays the same and it's the bottom that changes. And hopefully you'll be able to hear that when I do this. So there's no modulation going on at all. Now I'm going to turn it to the left. You hear that? It's getting quieter as it goes down, the modulation goes down, but it doesn't get any brighter than the maximum level that's set here. So it's exactly the opposite of this. Now that's become the quietest point, the lowest point, and it gets brighter as I turn this knob to the right. If I turn it to the left, then the brightest point stays the same and the dullest point gets wider. So it's sort of like negative attenuation, going to a negative and positive attenuation here. The weird thing about attenuation is that it's sort of odd in the sense that when it's at 0, that's actually when it's at maximum value. It's attenuating from both ends right to the center, so nothing actually affects it. It just keeps exactly the same. And the more you turn it to the right, the more of the upper range you allow of voltage. The more you turn it to the left, the lower range of voltage is affected. So you can get an interesting range of things. For example, you could modulate between this point in the filter and this point by setting the start point to be here and then turning the knob to the right so it will go from here around. Or you could set the brightest point to be here, and turning the attenuation knob to the left will mean that it will go from here round to here, but will never be any higher than this point. So how you use it makes a difference. And it seems maybe a little complicated, but if you play with it, you'll understand how it works. And you soon learn the sort of rules on how modulation can work with something. Now, I've been using an LFO to modulate, but of course you can use all sorts of different things as modulators. So now I'm going to show you a different type of modulator to affect the filter. Okay, so here's a different patch, and you'll notice that instead of having an LFO over here, I've now got a Turing machine. Well, yes, because a Turing machine is a great source of random voltages. And, you know, random voltages are another form that you can use to control modulation. Instead of with an LFO there being a smooth increase and then decrease of a voltage, something like a Turing machine gives you random voltages across a range. So this can give you an entirely different form of modulation for, in this case, as an example, the filter. So here is the basic sound without any modulation. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the pitch output, which when a sequencer sends pitch information, really is just a series of voltages ranging from 0 to 10 volts. And I'm going to take that and I'm going to feed it into the CV input of the filter cutoff. Now I've turned the attenuation way up to get a nice range of opening and closing of the filter, and I've also increased the scale range of the Turing machine so it outputs pitches CV information from the full range of 0 to 10 volts. I've also fed the Turing machine a clock so it will send out these random voltages in synchronization with the speed of this clock, in this case eighth notes at 120 BPM. And this is what it sounds like. Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. Yeah, it's that sort of effect that Keith Emerson used with Emerson, Lake and Palmer for that track. It's this opening and closing of the filter randomly to give different values of filter at random throughout a repeating note. If I increase the clock speed to here, the gate is still triggering at eighth notes, but the filter is opening and closing at 16ths. if I increase the gate to 16ths, you'll hear it happening even more so. And then back to 8th notes. Now, if I change the variation of the cutoff itself, we will hear a wider range of cutoff notes in time with this pulse, because the Turing machine is still sending out the same random information. So I'll show you what I mean when I press run. See, you got a filter closing much more on occasion and opening much more on occasion. And if I set the cutoff to sort of like about here and reduce the attenuation, then you'll still get changes, random changes in the filter position, but it's over a narrower range, so it's not such a dramatic effect. And again, if I open it up, you can hear the full effect happening again. Okay, so in this patch, I've now added back in an LFO. I've kept the Turing machine, but I'm going to add some increased complexity to the modulation. Just with the Turing machine connected, this is what we have. Okay, so that's that Emerson, Lake and Palmer randomly open filter effect. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an output from the LFO here, and I'm going to put it into the LV input on the console mixer. Now, this is the console mixer from VCV. It's one of their pay-for plugins, and it has a lot of modulation inputs here, which you can use to control things. And in this case, the LV input is the volume level for this channel. So this LFO is going to be increasing and decreasing the volume of the channel over time at the same time as the Turing machine is randomly sending pitches through this modulation input of the filter to the tiny saurish. And so this is what you get. So they clearly hear the volume of the track going up and down. Now I'm going to take another output from here and I'm going to put it into the pan modulation input of the strip for this particular channel. So what this will do is, if I change this and give it a slightly different frequency to this one, not only will the volume go up and down, but the stereo position of the voice will move from left to right in time with this LFO here. So now we'll have three types of modulation going on. We'll have filter modulation, volume modulation, and pan modulation. And it will sound something like this. Now, if you weren't wearing headphones or you're not using a good stereo pair of speakers, you probably wouldn't have heard that. So I recommend just popping on a pair of headphones just to hear the effect. But what was going on was the sound was moving from the center position to the right position of the speaker and then back to the center. If I want the pan to work from the full left to the full right, then I've got to turn the pan knob for the channel to the left so that this modulation works across the whole range of the stereo image. So now let's try it again, but this time with the pan knob turned hard left so the full range of panning can be heard when modulated by this LFO. There you go. And notice one of the tricks that I use with this is to make sure that the frequency, the speed of this LFO for the volume change is not the same as the speed for the pan change, because then you get what we call cross modulation effects, where it's never quite the same each time the two LFOs modulate. There's a constant random changing to it. Sometimes it will be loud when it's panned over to the left. Sometimes it might be quiet when it's panned over to the left. Sometimes it will be loud when it's panned over to the right. Sometimes it could be quiet when it's panned over to the right. And so this constant changing, this sort of modulation evolution effect to the sound, means that you get a constant, always changing sonic landscape, a sound that never stays the same all the time. Let me play it again so you can hear that happening. So there you go. That's another bit of modulation. Now for this final patch in this part of modulation, I'm going to add two more types of modulation to the sound. The first one I'm adding is by taking, again, an output from this LFO, because this is the tri-LFO, so there are three different LFOs. Take the output of that and put it into the CV input of the envelope. So in this case, changing the decay at over time. So as the LFO opens and closes, the decay of the note will get shorter and then longer and then shorter and longer. So this gives a different envelope for every note that's played. And then, and I'll let you listen to that so you can see how just that works, okay? So here's this one. See how the notes got very short? And then over time, the note will start getting longer. And then shorter again. And of course, this is going on whilst both the volume changes are happening and the panning modulation and the filter opening and closing modulation. So that's four types of modulation going on. And now I'm going to add one last one. And that's using the second output from the Turing machine, which generates, again, random voltages, just like this one did that we used for opening and closing the filter. I'm going to use this to open and close the resonance. So this gives those high-pitched, what I call squeaky sounds every so often, emphasis in frequencies based on what the filter. And because, again, these are at random, sometimes they'll work with this cutoff, sometimes they won't. So you'll get a constant evolving sound that's always changing. Something like this. And you can hear those little high-pitched like pings every so often. Now, if I add a little extra reverb to this, and I'm also going to add some delays to it, then you start getting a really interesting sequencer track. And all I'm doing is sending single pitches, but all the motion, the movement, everything else is being created by modulation. And if I make the pitches repeat slower, in other words half speed, and let the echo do its work, you get some even more interesting little rhythms. And to finish off, what I've done now is I've added another Turing machine to produce some random pitches for the tiny saurish, going through a quantum quantizer and a bog audio stack for changing the octaves. And I've also added a kick drum, and I've also taken the other output from the Turing machine and put that back into the modulation input for the tiny saurish to change the waveform. And now you get an entire melodic part all modulated in different ways to give you a constantly changing, evolving sequencer pattern like this. So there you go. There's a basic introduction to modulation. Try modulation out on all sorts of different types of modules. You'll find a lot of modules have patch points which you can then feed modulation into and experiment and see what they do. Remember that modulation is your friend as far as making things sound more interesting in your patches, so sounds aren't so static and don't keep sounding the same each time they play. Give a bit of variation to it. Sometimes you don't need to make it wide variations, you can just use small amounts, but it keeps things tonally interesting throughout the piece. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below and I'll respond as soon as I can, as always. And there'll be more of these Rack to Basics coming up. There may even be another one later on in this episode. But I will ensure that we do at least one of these a week, because I know from my point of view, when these sort of things were explained to me, they made a huge amount of difference to the type of music and the quality of it that I was producing. So I'm hoping in some small way this series will help you guys too. Thanks. Bye. And now it's time for another in the series of 10-minute modules from Greg.
Hello folks, this is Greg from Modular Curiosity, and welcome once again to 10-minute module. Today I'm going to be talking about the Frozen Wasteland quad Euclidean rhythm. So let's start the clock and get right into it. Okay, so what are Euclidean rhythms? Well, from the name, you might expect that it's somehow related to the 4th century BC mathematician Euclid, and you would be right. And it's based on what's called the Euclidean algorithm. And basically, it was a way of finding the greatest common divisor of two integers that divides them both without leaving a remainder. And what it comes down to is this algorithm, this way of breaking down into smaller and smaller groups to find out how can you say fit how many of these C's into A, and so on and so forth. It winds up finding some really interesting rhythmic combinations if you look at those divisions as rhythmic. That probably made no sense at all. It's going to make a lot more sense if we look at it visually. So let's go back to Rack and take a look at this. Okay, so I've zoomed in here, and what we have is this clock walking across in 16 beats. And on channel 4 here, I have a drum, kick drum, and I've divided these 16 beats into 2 divisions. Now, that makes a lot of sense to us, right? And if I went to 4 divisions, remember we're looking at the bottom row here, that also makes sense to us. Okay, well, 4 divisions out of 16 beats is every 4 beats. We do that all the time. So quickly, tell me, how many beats would be between 3? No fractions allowed. Well, you're right. 3 doesn't go into 16. 3 goes into 18, but it doesn't go into 16, so how do we divide it by 3? Well, as a result of that algorithm we were looking at earlier, we can actually do that. We can say, okay, we'll have 3, but notice that the divisions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 between these 2 beats, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's as close as you can get it. And yes, they're not going to be even, but this is the closest distribution you can get. What if we did 5? And all I'm doing is I'm turning the division knob here. This is the number of steps. Bum, bum, bum. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hey, what if we put, say, 8 divisions here? 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, you've probably heard that rhythm before and not really realized what it was. Well, it's a Euclidean rhythm. It's a way of breaking up an integer number of divisions that does not normally fit within the number of steps. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give 4 beats per 16. So we have nice quarter notes. That way we can hear our rhythm. But guess what? It turns out that we don't have to have Euclidean rhythms over 16. So for example, I'm going to bring this down to, say, 5. Now, how would I divide 3 beats over 5? 1, 2, I'll turn this division knob until I get 3. So I have 5 beats here, and I've split 3, which means I'm going to have a little double beat from bump, bump. Let's see what that sounds like, and I'm going to put it over to this resonator. That's kind of an interesting polyrhythm, isn't it? Well, guess what? I have 4 channels. So I'll tell you what, let's take the steps of the next one down to, say, 7. And let me put 5 beats. There's 3, 4, 5. No, how about 4? Let's try 4. Why not? See, because we have a 5-beat pattern and a 7-beat pattern, they're sort of cycling, even though they visually say they line up here, line up here, line up here. Because this is a longer pattern, you can see from where the green boxes are, that's the current beat, that they're offset, and we're creating these really cool polyrhythms. So now let's add a third one. How about maybe a 9? Perhaps 4 over 9? Why not? We can get some really interesting rhythms. How about if we space this out to, say, 3 divisions over 9? Now 3, that would be an even number of divisions, right? Oh, I'm pushing the wrong one. I'm pushing 2. And which one is that 3? Let's turn up damping so we can hear it. What if I start playing with rings, with the resonator? Okay, we can get some really cool sounds. But let's go back to drum sounds, because there's more to this. See, we also have an offset. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take, say, just that 3rd row. Offset is, notice how these yellow squares are lined up. I'm going to push them to the right. Oh, wrong knob. There we go. I'm going to push them to the right. So I'm offsetting where that beat is. So what if I do something like feed a square wave to the offset? Let's see how often. There it goes. There it goes. Okay. So as this square wave is going up and down, notice it's shifting these. There it goes. So we can get some really interesting rhythms by shifting within the number of steps, the divisions. So let's do that with the offset of the 3rd one. And let's bring him back in. And we should see this switch. Oh, there it is. See it? There's a shift. So now we're getting even more constantly changing variation. Pad is really kind of interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this step back up to 16, and I'm going to put, say, better yet, let's bring it down to, say, 10. Okay, let's do 3/10. Now, pad, right now, there are 3/10. Well, what I'm saying is there's 10 steps, 3 divisions. But what I can do is I can move those 3 divisions within the pad. See, so I've moved the 3 divisions, I've squished them off to the right. That's what pad is doing. Well, you can see if I turn accent, it's going to highlight cells. On those cells, I'm going to get a pulse here. So let's say, hear that click? That's because on that one, I'm pushing the structure way up high. And of course, accent rotate is I can rotate where those accents are. Let's do that with something like this. That is exceedingly cool. All right, folks, that's the Quad Euclidean Rhythm Generator. This is Greg from Modular Curiosity and 10-Minute Modules, and I'm sending this back to you, Nigel. All right, remember, stay curious. Bye.
Wow, that was really good, Greg. Thanks so much for that episode, and I really look forward to the next episode of 10-Minute Module in next week's Talking Rackheads. Okay, so what's next? Hi, today I'm going to take a preview look at 4 new plugins from AS. Freddie has been working on some new plugins that are basically sequence or pattern related, and this is just a quick look at 4 of these new plugins that should be released in the next week or so. These are beta versions that I'm previewing, so some of the features may change slightly or the look may change slightly, but I thought these were so good that it was worth giving you an idea of what's coming along in the pipeline from AS, as I've got pretty excited over these, as I've been waiting for something like this for quite a while. So the first one I'm going to take a look at is ReBeat. Now, in my Eurorack, I have this module called Trigger Riot, and it's a wonderful module that's great for doing quite interesting and complex polyrhythms and poly trigger patterns. And ReBeat is sort of similar to that. It has a very unique way of working, which I'm going to cover in a moment, and it can generate some very, very interesting polyrhythmic patterns. So, how does it work? Well, first of all, you have to feed it a clock. So I've got a clock being fed from the BPM clock up here, and I'm feeding it 8th notes at 120 BPM. Then you have a series of 16 knobs, each of which can have a value from 0 to 32. And what these are in essence, each one is a clock divider. So at the moment 00 means that no clock is being passed through ReBeat through this one here. And what that means is that there's no trigger coming out of this output, which is for this row of 4 clock dividers, and this one's going to a bass drum off screen. So if I turn this knob to 1, you'll hear the bass drum playing every eighth of the note, every eighth of the beat, because as a clock divider, that's exactly what 1 does. So there we hear the clock firing off triggers at exactly a division of 1 of the input clock coming into it. If I change this to 2, now it's every other beat, because the clock has been divided by 2, so now it's pushing out a trigger every 2 clocks. If I change it to 4, now the trigger is pushing out the clock is pushing out triggers at 1 every 4 incoming clocks. So that's basically how one control works. Now if I turn on a hi-hat, and I'm just going to let the hi-hat run at the division of 1, which means that it's going to be playing 1 trigger every clock pulse received, and I turn the bass drum to 4, now we have a bass drum playing every 4 beats and a hi-hat playing every beat. And that's just the very basic, simple way this works. It's just a series of clock dividers that send out triggers to whatever you attach to the other end of the output. But where this gets really interesting is that you have rows of these clock dividers and they all interact. So to give you an example of what I mean, I'm now going to turn the second knob here to 3. And what that means is it will play a bass drum beat every 4th note, and it will play a bass drum beat every 3rd beat as well. Now we're starting to get some interesting little rhythms going on. And if I change this to 5, we get a different pattern. Now if I change this one here, the third one, to 3, we get an interesting pattern that is longer than 4 steps, because this is the maximum number of these things I can combine together. But if you listen, it's evolving over time. Now I've changed this one to 7. So basically we've got a bass drum pattern that's playing every 4th beat, every 5th beat, every 3rd beat, and every 7th beat. And these all are summed together and pushed out of the output for this first row. Let me just turn these back off. So now we're back to a bass drum beat every 2nd clock. Now I'm going to do the same with a hi-hat. So now you can hear the hi-hat playing away. And again, it's a combination of clock divisions sending out different triggers from here. And if I change the bass drum pattern, we get some interesting changing polyrhythmic patterns from both the bass drum and the hi-hat. So that's how it works in terms of rows. But also what's really odd, if you like, but really a lot of fun to play with, is that not only does it work on rows, but it uses the same values for columns. And you can take an output from the column of the clock dividers, and that will also give you a different pattern. So you've not only got 4 different possibilities for each row, but you've then got 4 different possibilities for each column too. And because some of the columns and rows share knobs, then the values are linked. So for example, if I put a value of 4 in here and nothing else in this row, then this would output every 4th beat and this would output every 4th beat. So you get this commonality for certain beats between certain outputs. Even if this was, for example, 3 and then 4 here, every 4th beat, this one would trigger as well. So you wouldn't trigger when it was a 3rd, but it would trigger on every 4th. And this allows you to build up very interesting and complex triggers and pulses all from one module. So let me give you an example of what I mean here. I've connected a tiny sawish to here, and I'm letting the Turing machine generate pitches for it. But the triggers for the envelope are going to be controlled by ReBeat. So this is what you get. What's happening there is that every 3rd clock and every 5th clock, a trigger's being generated and sent to the envelope off screen here to alter the VC filter, which is filtering the tiny sawish. So it gives an interesting rhythmic pattern that's being generated by just these 2 columns. I'll play it again, but I'm going to turn on some of the values in these 2 columns to add the percussion to the part. But remember that when I change these 2 knobs here, this will also affect the bass part. So this synth part here will start connecting together with the bass drum part and the hi-hat part. Now, I don't know if you could hear that, but what was happening was the bass drum is playing every 4th clock and also every 3rd clock, but on every 4th clock, the synth part was also playing a note. So these 2 were linked on every 4th beat. And the same with the hi-hat. The hi-hat was playing every 2nd clock, plus every 5th, plus every 3rd, but on every 2nd clock, a trigger would also be sent to the synth part. So it was locked to the hi-hat part every 2nd beat, and it was also locked to the bass part every fourth beat. Now, that probably sounds ridiculously complicated, but the reality is it gives you this ability to create these wonderful interlocked rhythms and patterns, where if you change the value of one knob, it can affect both the row and the column, and keeping them rhythmically locked together, which is quite an interesting effect. And if I turn down everything except this one here, you'll see what I mean by interlocked. So you can hear that the synth is playing every fourth note, as is the bass drum. And if I speed up, in other words, divide this by just 2, the synth part is also divided by 2. Now if I make that into 3 triplets and then make this into 2, now the bass drum is playing every second beat plus every third beat, but the synth is only playing every third beat. And if I change this one to 5, now the synth part is playing every third and every fifth beat, whereas the bass drum is playing every second and every third beat. So some of the beats from the bass drum were triggering at the same time as the synth parts, and some weren't. And you get that interesting sort of cross rhythm, syncopated synth lines to go with your main beat. And of course you can use this for synth parts or percussion parts. You can use it for effect changes. You can do all sorts of things, and they can all be linked but syncopated to each other. So you get these marvelous cross rhythmic patterns and polyrhythmic patterns going on, where each one's interacting with the other, but at the same time are by themselves too. You also have mute buttons here that allow you to turn off steps when you're playing live. So for example, if I start this playing again, if you listen to the synth line, I'm going to mute the fifth note, or actually mute the third note, and you'll see what happens. So now the synth is only playing every fifth beat, and the bass drum is no longer playing every second and third, it's only playing every second. Now they're both playing on the third beats as well. And if I mute the fifth, now it's the synth part is only playing on the third beat, whereas the bass drum is playing on both the second and the third. So that's ReBeat. It's a really interesting way of creating rhythmic patterns and triggers and pulses that you may not have thought about, and they're all interactive depending on which column and which row you connect everything to. And yes, you can have 4 outputs from the columns and 4 from the rows, so that gives you 8 different polyrhythmic patterns from one module that are all interlinked, and that's pretty cool. Now ReBit is in essence just one of these columns. So it's like a cut down version of ReBeat. And again, you can do exactly the same thing. You can take a sum here of one column. Now there are obviously no rows, but there are columns. So you can take a sum of the clock divisions from each level here, and they sum just like this output here took the values from this column. This does the same here. But the other way of using ReBit is to use it just as a 4-channel clock divider by taking outputs from here to your devices, whatever you want to control the clock with, and just feed it a standard clock in here, and then you've got 4 clock dividers which give you a range from 0 to 32. And the 0 clock is an important one, and it's something that a lot of clock dividers don't have the capability of doing, and that is sending no clock. So you can stop a part for a period of time and then start it by giving it a clock, and 00 sends no clock at all. So a sequencer, for example, wouldn't play until you set a value in here, which can be quite useful for interesting effects. And again, it has its own mute buttons. Now, the next module is ReQ, and ReQ is a quantizer, and it's a quantizer with some very nice little functionality. And to show you that, I'm using, again, the Turing machine with its output, which is unquantized, going into the input of the quantizer, then out from the quantizer, and in this case, I'm feeding that into one of the 3 ReNote channels on here. And ReNote is a octave and semitone transposer. So this is what you would use to drop the whole pattern down by an octave or 2 or 3, or to tune it to the pitch of a different sequence pattern. For example, at the moment it's at 0, but if I move that to 5 plus 5, that would give me a 4th up. And as these are CV controllable, that means you can now transpose patterns on the fly using control voltage. So that becomes a very useful way of handling things. But getting back to ReQ, ReQ has several interesting functions which can be found on other quantizers. But what I like about this is that it puts them all in one place and does something a little different as well. So first of all, we have the root of the sequence. So that is that basically this is C, which means when it receives 0 volts, it's going to generate a C. If it receives 1 volt, it'll be a C 1 octave above. 2 volts, a C 2 octaves above, and so on. Then we also have an octave range indicator, which is this control here. And what the range does is it's sort of not quite what you're used to, and that might sound a bit odd, but it's true. If you've ever used the scale knob on a Turing machine, you'll know what I mean, in that this is not just saying, well, play notes from 4 octaves. It sort of scales it down and attenuates it, which makes it more musical. It can play notes from anywhere in a 4 octave range, but it does it in a musical sense, not just at random across 4 octaves, which can give some very interesting effects. And I'm going to demonstrate those in a moment. And then the final part of the display is the Q note. And what that is a real-time indicator of what note is being generated by the quantizer. This is extremely useful. For example, from the Turing machine, when it's generating its pitches, you've got no idea what those pitches really are. But with the ReQ, you can see what the pitches are in real time and know what notes are being generated by the Turing machine. So that's really helpful. And then finally at the bottom here, you've got the scales, and the scales are selected with this knob here. And again, you've got all the typical scales you expect, but you also have a none setting, which is a way of turning off the quantizer's features, which is really useful too. Instead of having to re-cable everything, you can just turn it off when you don't need it and then turn it on. And also, if you notice, one thing Freddie's done is reordered the scales so they actually make more sense to me. For example, off followed by chromatic, followed by major, minor, harmonic minor, melodic minor, instead of them being almost a sort of random or alphabetical order, which never made much sense to me. So I really appreciate that little tiny detail. Now, one last thing I want to look at before I give you a quick demonstration of what these things can sound like is the ReNote itself. There are 3 octave and semitone transposers, and these are normalized. So if you feed an input into the top input here, that input can be used for each of the 3 outputs, which allows you to set up chord patterns. You can manually set them up by, for example, rotating the semitone knob like this. So, for example, this would be a minor chord. If I change the 3 to a 4, this would be a major chord. And again, it gets its information from the root note that you feed here. So this is a very quick and simple way of setting up chords. And again, because these are all CVable, you can change the chord type on the fly by sending control voltages, which is a very nice little touch. Finally, not only are they normalized, but you can chain them. So for example, you could take an output from here and feed it to the input here, and whatever this is set to is added to whatever this is set to. So for example, if I set this to -3 octaves and I set this to -3 octaves, then this output would generate a note 6 octaves down, not stuck to the normal limit of 3, which most modules is all they allow. And then you have to typically try and do all sorts of pitch changing and attenuation and all sorts of things to get lower octaves. With this, you don't need to. You just feed an input into here and it automatically produces an output here that's the combination of these 2 parts of ReNote. In other words, these 2 channels. And you could, get ridiculous and do this, and then this one would be 9 octaves lower, which I can't think of anybody wanting, but hey, anything's possible these days. So bear that in mind. Sorry, it should go down to this one here. Bear that in mind that these are chainable, and so that's something you can link together. The same also applies with ReBeat, for example. You could, if you wanted to, take an output from one of these and connect that to the clock input of another ReBeat, and then that would give you a pattern of clocks from here, because ReBeat doesn't require steady clocks and it doesn't quantize the clocks. It will take any pulse input of any rhythmic pattern. So then you can start creating very, very complex patterns. Or take the output and feed it to the clock of a ReBit and add an extra channel onto it, which can give some very interesting effects too. So bear in mind, that's what you can do if you chain things together. And one thing that Freddie does with his modules is he tries to always make sure you can chain them together to expand their capabilities if needed. The other thing I like about Freddie's stuff is he really does put as many CV inputs as he can that's feasible and usable and practical in each of his devices. So in the ReQ, for example, both the root note, the range and the scale are all CVable. The same applies with ReNote, the octave and the semitone are both CVable. So this allows you a great amount of control when you're using these modules. So now for a couple of patches using the modules. Here I'm using a Turing machine to generate random pitches, one channel of ReBit to create both the clock for the Turing machine and the trigger for the envelope for the VC filter and the tiny saurish. I'm then using ReQ to quantize, and you can see here the note has been generated, and I'm using an Enolian scale, and I've also given it a range of possibly 5 octaves, and I've increased the scale here. And then finally I'm using the ReNote, and I'm chaining bits together so that I can get some additional octave ranges from it, as well as using the output from the Turing machine to modulate the tiny saurish's waveform. So this allows me to create some really interesting squelchy type basses. Here's what I mean by this. Yeah. Now, again, all I'm using for the audio side is just a simple tiny saurish. But by using the octave switches here and also ReBit for doing the patterns and triggering the filters and adding a bit of resonance, you can get some really amazingly squelchy, deep, throbby type bass sounds out of a single oscillator that makes it sound like it's much more than it really is. And in this last patch, I'm using the same combination of ReBit, ReQ and ReNote. But what I've done now is use ReNote's pass-through capability to create 2 additional voices, which I have tuned using the transpose knobs on the ReNote to create chords for these 2 tiny sauruses down here to generate. And I'm using a different trigger pattern from the Turing machine so that the notes from the chord play at different times, but also together with the original bass part. And it sounds something like this. So there you go. It's a really interesting way of creating chordal patterns to go over a bass line in VCV Rack. Really love these modules. As I said, I'm a great fan of Freddie's work anyway, but when he showed me these, I was like, oh wow. And again, you know, for me, they have a way of working together which is greater than the sum of their parts. It's like, well, it's just a simple clock divider plus a quantizer plus a octave and transpose, but you can make them work together and create this sort of like really interesting different type of rhythms, etc. together. And with the other modules that are coming out, plus the ones I showed you today, his range of plugins are becoming like essentials in my collection. I find I use them more and more in each and every patch. Again, I don't know when these are going to be released. I would imagine it will not be any more than a couple of weeks. I know he's waiting on the release of 0.6, but I think these will be out shortly after that, if not around about the same time. But again, Freddie will post up in Facebook when they're available, and I highly recommend grabbing them as soon as you can, because they're really, really good and incredibly useful. Okay, any questions, leave them in the comments below, as always, and I'll try and answer as many as I can. Thanks, guys. I often get asked how I create some of my rhythmic beds for some of the patches I do, and it's always difficult to explain because, well, it's always different. But there is one fundamental method I use when I'm creating what I call pulsating pads or drones that I want to sort of quickly demonstrate to you today. Here is a really basic setup. What I've got is I've got 3 tiny saw-ish oscillators, probably one of the most simple oscillators there are, and then 3 filters, one for each oscillator. And the filters I've set up with different cutoffs and resonances, and the oscillators I've set up with different frequencies and different tonal quality through their mod control. Now they're all tuned so that they're in octaves from each other. And so I'm going to let you hear that little bit first. So there's the first oscillator. A very standalone, stagnant voice. No movement, no nothing. Here's the second one. And there's the third one. And that's just the basic output from the 3 oscillators with nothing happening. Now, whenever I want to add some random movement to something, what I find myself doing is going straight to Matthew Friedrichs' Hot Bunny series of plugins, because these are wonderful. And in this particular patch, I'm using the Hot Bunny, and I'm also using the new Splitting Hairs, which is a great sort of addition to the range. And what I've done here is I've set up a clock generator section. So this is generating the master clock from my BPM clock. It's taking that and then it's splitting the clock into different outputs here. And each one I'm running to different clock-ins on each of the modules. I'm also taking some direct clocks again at different rates from the BPM clock. And I'm using the different outputs, like the LFO output here and the shift output, and all these are being modulated by each other, so they create outputs that are different speeds and different values. It's just a jumble of different things, and I work out what to do here purely by experimentation. I just plug things in, switch things around, rotate the knobs, just play with it until I get the sort of effect I'm looking for. So in this case, I've used the outputs from the Splitting Hairs, and I'm using these buttons, these flow buttons here, to just interrupt the flow of the information coming from here to the various settings for the filters. So each one of these goes to a cutoff or a resonance for each of the filters to give different rhythmic and values to them as I let the thing play. And what you end up with over time is a constantly evolving and changing pulsed type of drone pad sound underneath. A little like this. And there you go. Again, such a simple little setup, but a really complex, evolving, multifaceted pad, drone, whatever you want to call it, type of sound that you could use as a bed for a patch. And it's all the hard works being done by the Hot Bunny and Splitting Hairs at generating all that random information that makes the thing come alive, rather than just that stagnant, static sound. You suddenly get this entire sonic landscape of things happening at random, different tonal qualities from the filter, little bits of resonance coming through, and then suddenly those pings out of nowhere, which are being generated by the fact that the cutoff on this filter and here, these happen at random, and when they come together at a certain specific set of values, then you get those ping sounds at the top. And again, that was quite accidental. I mean, I didn't know that was going to happen. This was just found by playing around with the various outputs and values here in Splitting Hairs and Hot Bunny, and just changing the levels and the values of the resonance and the attenuators on the resonance, and setting up the modulation values here to give different tones. It's just a matter of experimentation, and this sort of setup allows you to experiment and come up with lots of different versions of what you might be looking for as the basic base sort of pad, the underlying foundation for a particular type of patch. Okay, as always, I'll be including this patch in the patch pack, which I'll be releasing. And while I remember the patches from the previous two TRs, I'm going to put together as many of those as possible too. Now we've updated to v0.6, so I'm going to be doing versions of those patches that will all work in 0.6. So there'll be sort of like a mega pack patch, probably released maybe 2 or 3 days after this video. Okay, hope you enjoy. Bye. In this video, I'm going to take a look at 3 new modules from AS. They are ReStep, ReQ, and ReNote. Now, let's start with ReStep. ReStep is a 4-step sequencer, and there are basically 4 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you set the pitch for each step by rotating each of the knobs. And you set the number of steps here using the step control. So you can have 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, and 4 steps. And the output here goes from the ReStep into ReQ, which is a quantizer. And there are 3 basic parts of the quantizer. You set the root note here, you set the range of the quantizer here, and you set the scale for the quantizer here. And we've looked at this in a different video, which will also be included in today's Talking Rackheads. And then finally you've got ReNote, which is an octave and semitone transposer. And then the output from that goes into, in this case, a tiny sawish with a filter and an ADSR. And this is what it sounds like. So it's a straightforward 4-step sequencer, and I can change the steps on the fly like this. I can mute any of the steps by pressing the mute button. And I can change any of the steps themselves, the step length of the sequence, by rotating the knob on the fly. And that's all there is to it. It's just a straightforward, very simple 4-step sequencer. However, that's not the end of the story, because ReStep has one extraordinarily powerful feature. And I'm going to show that to you now, and then you'll understand why I'm so excited about ReStep, because it really is a very special sequencer. Yes, it's chainable, which means you can have step sequences of any length you wish. It could be 4 steps, 10 steps, 21 steps, 33 steps, 16 steps, 19, you name it, whatever length you want, you can have. And all that flexibility of changing the step size on the fly, mutes on the fly, pitch on the fly, still is all there for you, no matter how many modules you link together. So in this case, I've put together a 48-note sequence that sounds like this. Bingo! We now have a step sequencer that can do exactly what number of steps we want. And that's been one of the biggest limitations of other sequencers, is that they were a fixed number of steps. And yes, you could combine sequences together using sequential switches and fancy clock techniques, but in this you don't. You just feed it one clock, just add another step, another module to the sequence, patch it up, and now you've got whatever step sequence length you want. Now I'm going to turn on the opacity of the cable so you can see how they link together. And really it's very straightforward. You just patch across from each cable like this. The only exception being the output to run cable, which goes from output to start, from output to start, from output to start, until you get to the last one, and the next output you link back to the start button at the beginning step so that the sequence loops. If you don't want it to loop, say you want it to be a one-time sequence, you can leave this out and it won't loop. But if you want it to be a constantly looping sequence, then you have to put this one in place. Other than that, that's all there is to it. You feed it a clock, you feed it a reset, so it all starts from the beginning, and you give it a run command. Again, I'm using Triggers Mark II to do this. And then everything else is just a straightforward cross-link. Very straightforward, very simple. And the cables don't get in the way of anything to any degree. And then the outputs, you just take the output trigger for the gate to your gate input of whatever you want to use, ADSR, so on. And the pitch, CV pitch output, put into ReQ, and then output from ReQ into ReNote if you want to have transpose capability, and then feed the output of that into the V-octave input of your oscillator, or again, whatever else you want. And this becomes an incredibly fun setup to play with. And I'm going to show you what I mean, because I'm going to sit here and just jam for a little bit, changing step lengths, changing mutes, changing pitches, and you'll hear how it all works together. There we go. I mean, such a flexible way of doing things, and you can just play with this on the fly, and that's the real gem of this, is you just play with it on the fly and create your sequences, change things, and of course you can have multiple sequences just by, you know, creating new ReStep sequences down here and have multiple instruments. So you can have an 8-step bass part, a 12-step chord part, and then a 48-step lead part. Whatever you want to do, it's entirely up to you. But you have that entire flexibility, which other sequences don't allow in the same simple way. You notice I'm not using any clock dividers, I'm not using any sequential switches. I'm just linking these together, and that gives me this wonderful capability of just building my own sequencer. And this is what AS did. This is what Freddie came up with, was when I was talking about build your own sequencer, this is what he came up with as a simple way of doing it. And my goodness, it works, and it works so well. And also the size of it works really well. I mean, for a 48-step sequencer, this isn't that large a set of modules at all. And again, I've built ones up to 160 steps for certain pieces, and I've done ones for just 3 steps. The range and the way you can put these together is wonderful. And the fact that you can mute gates and you can mute steps, but it carries on playing with each step, doesn't lose it, or you can change the step size on the fly and everything still stays connected and in time with everything else. That's a really special trick. So this is ReStep. Really simple but wonderfully connectable and usable and playable sequencer. And it's certainly going to be one of those ones that I'm going to be using in a lot of patches in the future for my own stuff, simply because I love that degree of playability and flexibility. Brilliant job, Freddie. I mean, seriously, brilliant job, my friend. This is an excellent thing. I don't know when it's going to be available to the public. I hope maybe very soon, or it could even be out by the time this video is released. I'm not sure, but I'm sure that Freddie will post up in Facebook letting everybody know when it's ready to go. Thanks, guys. On to the next video. Hi, this is another in the series of 5 patches from 5 modules in 30 minutes. Except, because it's been a while since I did one of these, this is a bonus edition, and I'm going to give you 10 patches from 5 modules in 30 minutes. So let's have a look at the 5 modules that I'm going to be using today. The first is the Benny from DBiz, a great, very flexible little sequencer based on the ReNote hardware for Eurorack. Then the second module is the Cornrows X, which is the macro oscillator from Audible Instruments, aka Braids from Mutable Instruments, but this is the slimline Cornrows X version, which emulates almost all of the hardware, which the macro oscillator version doesn't. It gives you so many more possibilities with it. And in essence, with these extra possibilities, Cornrows X can be easily made into a standalone synth voice, an all-in-one if you like, because it has its own envelopes, VCA and so on. The next one that I'm going to be using is Rakes, which is the stereo resonator. Again, this is the South Pole slimline version. This generates all sorts of really interesting resonating over waves and all sorts of things going on, overtones and so on. And you'll notice in some of the patches there is some distortion. That is entirely deliberate. I like a bit of dirt and grit in some of my patches, and the Rakes really can add some little flecks of distortion and some really bits of grime to things, as well as some gorgeous overtones as well. Then the next module I'm using is Tangents by Vult, the wonderful Steiner Parker filter, which again is one of those filters that's got a character all of its own, and Vult has really captured that character in Tangents, one of my favourite filters. And finally, I'm using the Tri-LFO from AS as a source of modulation. Love this module because it's 3 LFOs in one, and it gives me the flexibility to add different modulation sources to all the possible inputs on each of these modules. I'm also using the BPM clock as a clock output. That's not counted in the 5. And finally, I'm using Trigger Smart 1 to turn up and down the volume. So again, that's just for the purposes of the video. There's also a bit of delay and a bit of reverb used on some of the patches. That's part of my normal setup. Okay, so let's listen to the first patch. A very straightforward patch, simple sequence, straightforward basic waveform coming from cornrows, a little tiny bit of resonance, a resonator overtones coming in, the filter working with a bit of resonance itself, and a simple sine wave being used to modulate the color, basically the tonal quality of this cornrow's voice. Okay, let's go to the next patch. So in this patch, we're using a different waveform in cornrows. We're also doing a lot more modulation thanks to the Tri-LFO. We've set up the filter slightly differently. We're adding a lot more random resonance coming from the rakes. And we've changed the sequence pattern, the key, and the scale it's working in to give some added variety. Bearing in mind this is just one oscillator plus the rakes, you're getting some very interesting harmonic qualities going on in this, and this is why I found these particular 5 modules worked really well together and generated a lot of different tones. So let's go to the next patch. Now in this patch I'm doing something different with rakes. I'm taking the outputs here from the Benet, and each one is being fed to a different channel in rakes, and this in essence gives a kind of chordal quality to rakes' output, on top of the cornrows playing a different waveform from a wavetable, which I'm stepping through slightly using the modulation, and again a slightly different filter setting. It's actually only just a tiny bit of difference, but it does make a big difference in the sound. And we're also going to get a slight bit of distortion on the chordal stuff from rakes because I'm overdriving it slightly, and again bit of modulation from the Tri-LFO to change the tonal quality of the cornrows voice, and this is what it sounds like. I like that one. I like the tonal quality of it. And I also like those little random chords coming in. Again, coming from the resonator itself, getting its tones from cornrows. Because I'm feeding, you know, out from the output of the cornrows into the input of the rakes, as well as taking a split signal going into the filter, so you get the original signal plus the rakes version plus rakes overtones as well, and these are also going all to the mixer. So in essence there's 3 channels of different sounds going on at the same time, but just from one oscillator. Okay, let's look at the next patch. Now in this patch I've slowed down the sequence, changed the key, changed the scaling of the sequence, and also you'll notice I've added some additional outputs from the sequencer into additional channels in the resonator. I've also turned up the resonator and I've tuned some of the outputs from the resonator to give a 5th chord, which when it distorts slightly gives that sort of electric guitar strum feel. It's not quite that, but it's interesting. And the rest of the patch is basically the same as the previous patch. It's just adding the extra distortion and the extra tone changes along with the tuning changes of the rakes gives a different feel to the patch. And I hope you see what I mean by that sort of distorted feel. Okay, next patch. Okay, patch number 5. Here what I've done is I've changed the sequence again and the key and also the tempo of the sequence to give it a more sort of arpeggiating feel to it. I've changed the cornrows waveform to a pluck sound to give that sound of a plucked string. I'm modulating both the outputs from the tri-LFO. So I'm taking one output and modulating the color of the sound of the pluck. But I'm also using an LFO to modulate the cutoff of the filter on the pluck sound to give some more tonal variety. I'm also taking another set of LFO outputs and I'm modulating the volume of the rakes channels in stereo, so they will actually both pan slightly and change in volume level to give a tonal change over time. And then finally I'm taking the outputs again from the sequencer, the lower column outputs, and I'm feeding them into the Vult per octave inputs of rakes, and I've tuned the channels in a pair, so left and right is one pair, left and right is another, and this gives a sort of strum chordal feel to it, which I find very interesting. It's almost at random what it plays as far as a chord, but it's definitely got some melodic quality to it. Here we go. Yeah, I like that. It's got a sort of slightly eerie feel to it, but it's good. Okay, on to the next patch. Now in this patch I've changed things around a little bit. Again, I've created a new sequence, changed the key, changed the scaling of the sequence. I'm only taking one output this time into the VOC of the rakes, but I've left the tuning where it is from the previous patch. I'm also modulating the color again of the waveform, so this is actually changing the waveform over time. There's some more modulation going on with the filter, but I've sped it up this time to give us sort of an open and closing filter effect, which changes the tonal quality very quickly over time, just gives it a different feel. And then finally, again, I'm fading in and out the volumes of the resonator to give tonal changes over time. Very different feel to the previous patch, even though a lot of it is much the same. Now, in patch number 7, I went for something a bit different. So again, I've changed the scale and the pitches of the sequencer and also the root of it, but I chose the wavetable ×4 to give chordal qualities to the output sound, because this is in essence 4 different notes at the same time. It's not, but you'll see what happens when I play with it. I'm also modulating both the modulation input and the color input for the oscillator to give those tonal changes. I'm using an input, a V octave input here from rakes coming from the sequencer to add some tonal quality and some overtones to the sound, but I'm also inputting 2 inputs. One is coming directly from the cornrows and one's coming from the output of the filter. So the cornrows goes into the low pass filter, and then its output goes both to its own channel on the mixer and back into the resonator, which then goes out to its own channel in the mixer. So we're sort of doubling up the sound, but it's 2 entirely different tones. And then again, I'm using the LFO to modulate both the filter and the modulation and color inputs on the cornrows. And this gives it a little bit more of a semi-random feel. It still keeps a little melodic flavor to it, but there are some quirky stuff going on in the background of this patch, which are all entirely up to the LFO and the randomization of the tones coming from cornrow being fed into rakes. And when you consider this is again just one macro oscillator running with a bit of resonance, there's a lot of different tones and quality of tones and pitches of tones going on that patch from what is simply a very simple configuration of 5 modules. And yet we're getting this big, fat, different sort of melodic sounds coming out of it. This is why I love doing 5 from 5 type things, because you learn how to use all these features in each of the plugins as you go along, just out of experimentation. Now, patch number 8 is a much more ambient sounding thing. I used the cloud output from the cornrows, and I took out all the V octave inputs. So I'm just letting the resonator work on its own basic tuning. And then I'm modulating both the FM input, the modulation input, and the color input for the cloud's waveform. And then adding a fairly fast sequence that's running in a very sort of atonal way, using a pentatonic scale, or pentatonic scale I should say, with lots of modulation and panning, you get a much more ambient, non-melodic sound. Something like this. Much more of a sort of drone feel to it, with all that sort of like textury stuff going on over the top. Now, as a development on from that last patch, here I've changed the oscillator to the drum set of waveforms, which aren't really drums, but they're like these wooden sort of like hitting instruments that have a very unique character to them. And again, modulating the FM input, the modulation and the color input gives lots of tonal changes to those wooden instrument hits that you get. And then I'm using two tone controlled and pitch controlled resonator channels here to give some melodic input to it. And again, I've changed the cutoff slightly, and I've changed the modulation speeds and feeding the inputs from, or the outputs from the cornrows, both to the mixer and back into the rakes, to give some feel of a semi-musical but still quite abstract feel to the patch. And for the final patch, number 10, I went from that last patch, which was quite atonal in many ways, into a very tonal pitched patch, which sort of, for me, takes back the sound to almost the 80s type synth parts and synth pieces. And again, using a different waveform and cornrows with modulation and 3 channels this time coming from rakes, including one that's being modulated via a slowly changing waveform out of the tri-LFO into the Vult per octave, gives that sort of like swoosh sound that happens every so often. But there's a lot of cross modulation going on. If you notice here, not only am I taking an output from the filter into both the rakes and straight to the mixer, but I'm also taking one output that's going into the trigger input of the cornrows, and this gives a very interesting effect with the envelope of opening and closing the envelope to give a more tonal change over time. So here's the last patch. And I love the way that Rakes, when you push it like that, actually gives that distortion on either side. And also I'm doing panning on that through the LFO. And I just like the tone of that final patch. It's got some really interesting, complex stuff going on in over time of the pitch, actually of the flavor of the patch changing. But yeah, you know, it's a fun little setup. So there we go. 10 patches from 5 modules in 30 minutes. And to be honest with you, I sat down with this after I did the initial patches for this, and just these 5 modules, I came up with something like around about 40 different patches to play with, all of which were quite different. And I found this actual combination really inspiring, lots of different types of sounds and content. And I've got to say, most of that comes because of the flexibility of Cornrow's X, which is astonishing. I mean, I could spend days just with this one module playing all the possibilities and things that it can do. Add to that Rakes and the Steiner Parker filter, which definitely adds some edge and some really nice filtering effects to things. And, you know, we've got a nice combination of modules in just these 3 to play with. The Bene I love as a sequencer. It's just so easy to use. And I love the fact that you can send different clocks in to change the direction and the speed of things at different times. So you can repeat rows. And like in this case, it's going down and then up and then down and then up on certain parts. I love those sort of effects. I also like the fact that it's got a out and a quantized out, so you can use both. And I often use the output to modulate a filter, which is quite interesting as well, at the same time as using the quantized output to generate quantized pitch for my oscillator. And then finally, as I said, the tri-LFO. If I don't want a clocked LFO, then I see myself using tri-LFO all the time, simply because it's 3 really great, very flexible LFOs in one package. Nice size, works great, has a nice reset input if I need it, does basically everything I would expect from an LFO, just a free running LFO. And I love that for its purpose. Okay, have any questions? Leave them in the comments below. And there'll be another 5 from 5 in the next couple of episodes or so. Cheers. Hi, and welcome to another Rack to Basics. And in this video, we're going to look at quantizers. Now, what's a quantizer? Well, when you have a sequence of pitches, electronic, basically voltages, they are literally any type of voltage. And so when you try to play specific notes, it's very hard to set a voltage to give you the exact in-tune note that you're looking for. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I've set up here a 16-step sequence with different voltages for each step. And this is what it sounds like. Sort of out of tune and funky sounding, and sometimes that's okay for the type of music that you're playing, but sometimes you want the notes to be more musical and in tune with each other. So it sounds like you're playing, for example, a synth or a piano keyboard, and the notes are in tune with each other. And that's really hard to achieve when you're just feeding in voltages and not knowing what voltage, exact voltage, equates to an exact note. And so this is where quantizers come in. Quantizers take a voltage input, what we call a volt per octave input, and they match the voltage coming in to the nearest note that they know about, so that these voltages suddenly become in tune with each other. depending on what you told the quantizer to do. Now, there are two types of quantizer. There's what we call a scale quantizer and a note quantizer. And I'm going to start by talking about the scale quantizer. And here's an example of one by JW. It's actually one of my favorite scale quantizers simply because it's really simple to use and it generates very accurate scaling, quantizing of pitches, random pitches to notes. So in this case, the quantizer is turned off. There's none here. I rotated this knob so it becomes none. So when I play the sequence of pitches that come from here, which are just random voltages basically, then you get that out of tune sounding sequence like this. But I want to force these pitches to match notes in a particular scale. And that's what a scale quantizer does. You choose a scale here by rotating this knob, and there's all these different types of scales. And what it does is it takes the output, here's the output from the sequencer, into the input for the quantizer, and then takes the output and feeds that. In this case, I'm going through the stack by Bog Audio just so I can change the octave if needed. But basically out from there into the volt per octave input of your oscillator. So now your oscillator will play notes in tune that match the notes in a particular scale. And this is why it's called a scale quantizer, because it forces the pitches to match the nearest note in any given scale. So in this case, I want these pitches to match as close as possible the notes in the C major scale. Now, when you play a major scale, it has a sort of happy sound. It's sort of nice and happy. And so that's what I want this to sound like. So now, when I press run, you'll hear the notes all conform to the notes in the C major scale. There won't be any ones that are out of tune. They will all match perfectly with all the notes that are found in the C major scale. And there you go. That's all the notes. Now if I rotate this back to none, you'll hear what it sounded like originally. All out of tune and all over the place. And if I rotate it back round again, now we're back to a nicely tuned major scale. If I change the scale here to something different, then the notes will conform to that different type of scale. For example, if I want it to be a sad sounding sequence, then I choose a minor scale. And now you can hear all the notes are conforming to the notes in the C minor scale, that sort of sad sounding scale. And I go back to major, and now they all conform to the major scale. So this is a very quick and simple way of making it easy for you to make up melodies using your sequencer so they fit and are in tune with each other using whatever scale you want. Now I've configured up the sequencer, instead of using the scale quantizer, to use a note quantizer. In this case, I'm using the Quantum from ML, one of my favorite note quantizers. And the difference between a scale quantizer and a note quantizer is that whereas a scale quantizer quantizes all the outputs, the pitch outputs from your sequencer to match a scale, a series of however many notes there are in a scale, a note quantizer allows you to select specific notes for the output from the sequencer to match. So you don't have to use scales, you can just use single pitches or combinations of notes that you want in your melody or bass line or whatever. So as an example here, I've chosen one note in the scale. In this case, let's say C. So that means that all the outputs from here, as they come out of the volt per octave output from the sequencer, will always be forced to be just one note, and that's going to be a C. It may be in different octaves, depending on the pitch here, how high the pitch is or low the pitch is, but they will only ever be the note that's selected here, which in this case is C. So it'll sound something like this. And there you go. Even though there's all sorts of different pitches being generated by the sequencer, the quantum note quantizer is forcing them to only output C's. Now if I add another note like a G, then we'll either get C's or G's out from the sequencer, depending on what's the nearest note to the pitch that the sequence is generating. There we go. And if I add an F, we'll now get C's, F's and G's. Except there was nothing close to it. So let's add a D. And now we're only going to get C's, D's, F's and G's. And if I rotate one of these knobs, and I can rotate these at random, it's still only going to generate C's, D's, F's and G's. Never going to do anything other than those four notes. If I replace the F with an E, there's an E coming in. And it's a bit of experimentation to find out how all these things work together, because each note affects each other one. And I like that from the quantum, because it gives you very interesting different melodic patterns from the same sequence depending on what notes you've selected. So I choose different notes, I'll get different patterns. And I'm not altering any of the pitches here, I'm just choosing different notes for it to match against. And so that's a note sequencer. So you have a scale sequencer that forces the notes to match the notes in a given scale, or you've got a note sequencer that forces the pitches to match a specific note that you select. Now, how could you use this in the real world other than just like for a basic output sequencer like this? Well, let me show you. This time I'm using a Turing machine, one of my favorite random voltage generators. And Turing machines generate all sorts of melodic patterns, but by default their output, of course, is unquantized. So it's just a random set of voltages and pitches that are all out of tune and all over the place, like this. Which is okay for certain things. But if you want something that's more musically relevant, then you need to quantize the output of the Turing machine. And to do that, we take the output from its output here, and we feed that to, in this case, the quantum's input, then out from the quantum into the V-octave output of the stack. And I'm using the stack only so I can control the voltages, but also I can transpose and make it into a certain key. So at the moment this is playing C's when this is set up, but say if I wanted that to be an E, I could rotate the knob here, and then this would be E's that come out of this one. So this is how you can tune this sequence up to other sequences that you're playing, or maybe samples of something, or an external instrument that you're playing along with, like a guitar, for example. So anyway, let me just take this back to where it was, and then I take the output from the Bog Audio stack into the V-octave input of my saw, which is then going through the filter, through the envelope, and to my mixer. So now, without touching anything on the Turing machine, let's listen to what the quantum outputs. And as I've only got one note selected, it should all be the same note, C. And lo and behold it is. If I add another note, say a G, we should get a mix of C's and G's. They're in different octaves, but it's still just C's or G's. And if I bring the octave down on the Bog, that lowers all the notes by, in this case, 2 octaves. If I add another note to the quantum, like an F, well, I'll get some Fs as part of the sequence. If I add a D, we're getting random notes, but all perfectly in tune with the notes that I've selected on the quantum. Add a B flat, and we've got a B flat appearing in there every so often. If I want to do something entirely different, I can choose different sets of notes like this, and now it will only play notes that conform with these 5 notes. In other words, all the black keys on a keyboard, giving that slightly oriental feel. And again, I can change the pitch here, raise it up an octave, change the saw wave, open the filter a little bit. Add a little bit of delay. and we get different styles of sequences being played. Now I've added a second synth voice, exactly the same configuration as the first. Now, Tinysaurus going to a diode ladder filter and a hitting envelope, both these by Vult. And what I'm doing is I'm using the second random pitch output from the Modular, the Turing machine, going into a second quantum, out from a second quantum into second stack, out from a second stack into the VCO output for that Tinysaurus. And I've given it its own channel in the mixer. So now we have two synth voices that can play at the same time. And this is where a note quantizer really comes into its own. Because what I've got here on the first one are giving it a choice of 4 different notes that it can force its pitches to. But for the bass part, I'm just giving it 2 possibilities. The 2 possibilities are the same as the 2 notes here, but it won't be able to play these 2 as they're not selected. And so this will give you a more bassy type bass part as compared to a more melodic lead part. But the tones, the pitches will match perfectly because they're being quantized. And then I also drop down the octave here using the Bog Audio stack to make it a more bassy sound. And you end up with something like this. And even though both of these voices are getting random pitches from the Turing machine, they're both being quantized so that musically they're related and they make sense to each other. And you don't get any of those really out of tune clashes that you would get if you didn't quantize the pitches. So there's just a basic idea of quantizers. They're very useful for these sort of things. For creating melodic tunes, for making sure that everything stays in tune, but also you can use them to create feels. As I said, if you use a scale quantizer and quantize to a major scale, you'll get a happy sounding melodic line. If you quantize it to a minor scale, you'll get a sadder sounding melodic line or a sadder sounding bass line. There are lots of other types of scales. There's, for example, a blues scale that'll give your melodic lines the feel of a bluesy type guitar or piano part. And then there are other scales, many different types, that give you these different types of feels, oriental feels. Even there's one scale that gives you that feel of Latin American type scaling. What you use is entirely up to you, but this is what quantizers do, is help generate and create and ensure that your voltages that are coming out of either your sequencer or your random noise generator or random pitch generator, they're always going to be in tune and therefore melodically relevant and interesting. So again, play with these sort of things, and there are lots of different quantizers out there. I've only shown you two. It's also worth noting that there are sequencers out there that have their own quantizers built in. And some of them even have their own scale quantizers built in. So that's worth looking at as well. But play around, try these different things out. I recommend starting with a scale quantizer if you've never used one before, and then progressing to a note quantizer and using them like in pairs here with two different voices, so you can see how they interact with each other and how by choosing some of the same notes on one as the other, then they become musically linked together and relevant. Okay, any questions? As always, ask them in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. And that's a wrap for episode 6 of Talking Rackheads. Hope you really enjoyed that one. If you've got any questions or whatever, put them in the comments below and I'll respond as soon as possible. To play us out this week, here's a little simple piece that I put together while I was waiting for 0.6 to update, and hope you like it. See everybody next week. Stay safe, enjoy your week, and have fun with VCV Rack. Bye guys.